We seem to be inundated with these sports style watches, these Garter style watches. Garter watches that tend to have a certain set of dimensions that are on steel bracelets, but in particular these sports watches with some really interesting and amazing dials. Dials that are perhaps 3D or even made out of interesting materials. And I'm really happy and excited that these watches are becoming more and more available to us. And I became even more excited when one of my favorite micro brands released their new collection of 4 Seasons watches that fit this criteria exactly. Hello, you're watching James. My name's James. You're watching me. And I am talking about watches. And last year I had the opportunity to get hands-on and have in my collection for a short time a watch that was released from the micro brand MMI. That was their Cuddlecron. It was a watch that I really liked and really connected with and that I kept thinking about. In fact, I actually kicked myself now that I didn't actually end up purchasing one for myself so it could be in my own personal collection. And because that has been in the back of my mind, when this brand MMI reached out to me again and said, hey, we've got a new release watch coming, I absolutely said, yes, I must get hands on with it, because if it is even slightly as good as that release last year, then I'm sure that I'm going to love it. And I've now got hands on in time for their pre-order of their new release 4 Seasons collection. And the one that I'm going to be sharing with you today, I don't think is a prototype. I think it is exactly as the watches are going to be if you decide to place an order for one. So I'm going to be able to show you around this watch in some details so you will know what you'll get if you decide to place a pre-order. But you may have noticed that there was this sponsored icon up there early on in the video, and that is because when these watches are ready to be officially shipped, I then get to have one. This one here has to be sent back because this is a demonstration model for videos like this, but then later on I get to have one and have that one in my collection, which I'm very excited about. And if you decide to purchase one for yourself, well, I'm going to leave some links in the description which will take you to the pre-order website or to their website themselves. And if you decide to buy one, like most pre-orders, it's worth getting that order in early because the pre-order price starts off relatively low, but then slowly creeps up and gets back up to their full retail price. And they will be starting off at $399 US, working their way up to $499 US. But then all you need to decide, other than when you're going to place your order, at what point amongst that pre-order period, is which color variation you are going to get, because there are 4. I have the pink dial version, which is called the Spring, but there's also a yellow dial version, which is summer, strangely enough, orange for autumn, and blue for winter. And all of them have a very special dial, which I'll be concentrating on shortly, but all of them also have the same general specifications that is worth being aware of, because they're all powered by a Miyota 9039 premium high beat movement with no ghost position, because there's no date on these watches. They all have 100 meters of water resistance without a screw down crown, a single domed sapphire crystal, and BGW9 lume on both the hands, the dial, and also a little touch on the crown, which is very cool. But if you are going to be buying one of these watches, there's a reasonable chance you're going to buy it because of the dial. And this dial, well, it is something rather special, because the dial itself is actually produced in collaboration with the MMI watch brand, but also with the AWAGAMI Factory, and I apologize for that pronunciation, but they've produced a handmade Japanese paper. And because it is handmade, that means that each dial of each watch will be slightly unique. And as you look closer at my variation of this one, you'll see that there is a real fibrous effect that almost has an organic feel to it, especially with those lines that are running through it. It also almost has a translucent appearance to it, and that comes across as you look at it in almost a delicate fashion, which may be why that they've chosen not to apply anything directly to the paper, because hovering above that paper dial is a clear disc. This clear disc is held down by screws on the left and the right hand side of the dial, which you can see, and on top of that disc you'll see that logo, the minute markers, and the word automatic printed on. And what's interesting about that printing is those elements of the printing appear obvious that they are printed on in black. But what is not as obvious is that the markers, both the numbers, the 12, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, and those other hour markers are also printed on. Because when I look at these markers, I start to think they have to be applied. There has to be a 3D effect to them because they do jump off that dial. But as you look closer, you'll see that no, they are actually printed on in a lot of lume, making it look nice and white. But then they're surrounded by a very thin printing of black, which then gives it this 3D, almost applied marker effect. The hands themselves also have a huge amount of lume within them and have a really nice pattern to them. So when you turn the lights off, you'll see that not only is the lume nice and strong, but it looks absolutely fantastic. But then when you turn the lights back on, you'll see those hands, well, they're nice and large and long. They have a really great, interesting pattern to them, and they are all polished. And I could spend a lot more time and detail looking at this particular dial, showing it at different directions under macro footage, out in the sun, and I'm talking right now so that it gives me the opportunity to put more and more B-roll footage of that particular dial. But of course, there is still a lot more to this watch beyond that dial. That dial itself is covered by that domed crystal, which has a very minor dome to it, and it almost looks flat when you look directly across it. But now the rest of the watch is actually very good as well. I think it's great that they haven't made it a huge feature of the watch that would take away from that dial, but it then still has plenty of details on it that really draw my attention. And then those details translate to a nice on-wrist feel too. And that has partly got to do with the dimensions of this watch, because the case itself is 39.5 millimeters. The height is 12.2 millimeters. The lug to lug is a really nice 46.8 millimeters. The lug width is a standard 20, and what is nice is that it is tapering down to 18 millimeters, which really helps with that on-wrist experience, and it only weighs in at 136 grams, which I think is actually a nice sweet spot for this Garda sports style watch. It is a nice weight that feels good and seems to suit this particular style. And I am finding this generalized dimensions of a watch is becoming a little bit of a standard and a bit of a go-to for brands because, well, it translates to a really nice on-wrist look, experience, and size. As you can see, it fits my 17 centimeter or a medium size wrist really well, but the good part about these dimensions is that it will definitely fit a smaller wrist too, and it will also look good on a bigger wrist. Something that actually surprised me about this watch, and it actually continues to surprise me because every time I go to action that crown, I realize that it is not a screw down crown. Yet it still has that 100 meters of water resistance, which I'm finding more and more that I really like. A non-screw down crown that has 100 meters of water resistance. I really am starting to realize that I like to keep a screw down crown in reserve for my dive watches. Beyond the dive watches, I actually prefer a non-screw down crown, but I still like that 100 meters of water resistance. And what's great about this movement is that it also does not have that ghost position. And also what's good about that 9000 series Miyota movement is not only is it an automatic movement, but it's a high beat movement, and it also has hacking and hand winding. And I'm finding that it also then translates into a thinner watch too, which really does then assist with how it then settles down onto wrist. And if you can create a case that has the right shape, as well as the right dimensions, as well as the right height, then this absolutely occurs, and it has occurred with this particular MMI watch. And I like what they've done with the case of this watch. It is subtle, yet there are still some features to it that I like. I like the shape of it, how it curves around the dial, but then sort of almost angles out a little bit to allow those lugs to stick out. There's a little bit of a downturn, which helps when you add that to the height, utilizing this movement to then hug down onto your wrist. And they've also used a combination of brushing and polishing on both the case and the bracelet. Probably a little bit more polishing than I expected for this watch, and that then translates to it feeling a little bit more dressy for me. But you'll see that that solid bezel, that's polished. The sides of the case and the center links of the bracelet are polished, leaving just the tops of those lugs and the outer links of the bracelet to be brushed. And there is enough brushing that it then breaks up that polish, but there's enough polish that it then feels a little bit dressy to me. And I've mentioned a number of times about that high beat Miyota movement, which you then get to see when you turn the watch over and look through that see-through case back. But one of the favorite things that I've been experiencing recently on watches that is featured on this one is a bracelet that looks and feels and is produced in the way that it has, because all of those links that you can see are individual links, and it is amazing how much more comfortable and how much more luxury feeling a bracelet feels when those links are all individual. You may find on some watches where it has a faux individual look, it looks fine, but there's a difference in the on-wrist feel when they are all individual like they are on this MMI watch. And it's a very interesting visual trick that they've done with those individual links, because this does taper down from 20 down to 18, which then really assists with that on-wrist feel too, but then doesn't take away from the design of the bracelet. They've obviously had to reduce the size of them as they've worked down towards that clasp, but it's not immediately obvious that that's what they have done. And the clasp that they have utilized, well, I could probably have almost described this clasp to you without seeing it, because it is becoming an almost standard for a watch in this category at this sort of price range. And I say that in a very positive way, because this is a great clasp which has on-the-fly adjustment, is all milled, and it is one of those on-the-fly adjustment that allows the end of the bracelet to go in and out seamlessly, without some weird sort of chunk coming out of it that I've seen on some other watches. This is a really nice clasp that then balances out the weight of this watch too. And as I looked at that dial, even before I had the opportunity to get hands-on with this one, I knew that would be the primary feature of this watch. If you're going to buy this watch, if you're going to own this watch, it's likely that it's because of the dial, but it is nice to see that the watch hasn't just put all of its effort into that dial. It has put more time and energy into other choices like the size, like the case, the shape, how it's going to fit on wrist, the individual links of that bracelet, and it has created a watch that is a nice watch to wear. It is a nice experience on wrist, and it is a really compelling package, especially at this sort of price range. So I really appreciate getting hands-on with this one, and I'm really looking forward to getting my unit to end up into my own personal collection. And I want to say thank you again to MMI. Make sure you check them out, especially early on in this pre-order if you're going to buy one. Save some money, and thank you so much for watching. I do always appreciate it. And you may find here's a couple other watch videos that you might enjoy watching next.